It was the spring of 1869 in the Oregon Territory, and they were selling a ghost for $2. The outpost was little more than a smudge of dust and desperation on the edge of the world. The air tasted of pine rot, horse sweat, and the kind of cheap tobacco men smoked when they had nothing left to lose. A makeshift auction stage, just a few planks laid over wagon crates, stood in the center of it all. Around it, a crowd of hard men gathered, their faces carved from wood and want, their eyes holding the dull shine of empty pockets and emptier souls. This was a place where mercy was a foreign language. A man with a rusted deputy badge pinned to a faded vest slammed a gavel down. "All right, last one for the day," he bellowed, his voice like gravel in a tin can. "She ain't got no name, ain't shown her face. Wears that sack over her head since Missouri." He pointed a dirty finger at the figure on the stage. "Says she can work, says she'll obey. Startin' bid, $2. He smirked. "Who's brave enough or drunk enough to marry the mystery?" A wave of cruel laughter cut through the air. "Maybe she's a witch under that thing," one man yelled. "Or a corpse," shouted another. "Might as well marry the damn sack." A few men spat in the dirt and walked away, but most stayed, nudging each other, a hungry look in their eyes. They wanted to see the fool who would take this bet. On the platform, she stood perfectly still. Barefoot, her hands tied in front of her with old twine. A stained sackcloth bag was pulled down over her head, tied tight at the neck. The only sign she was alive was the slight rise and fall of her shoulders, her breaths coming quick and shallow. She was terrified, but she was controlling it. Her bound fingers would twitch, clench, then release. A silent war fought in the cage of her own hands. The auctioneer grumbled, "She's no good to anyone if she won't even speak." Silence. No one moved. The wind kicked up dust, and for a long minute it seemed the girl in the sack was worth less than nothing. Then the crowd parted. From the back, a man walked forward. He was tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the whole damn forest. His canvas coat was worn, his black hat shading a face that looked more comfortable with trees than with people. His boots were caked in mud, and an axe handle, wrapped in leather strips, was tucked into his belt. He was a man made of timber and silence. He stopped before the stage, and his voice, low and steady, cut through the quiet. $2. The world seemed to stop. The auctioneer squinted, leaning forward. "You sure, mister?" "I said what I said." There was no anger in his voice, no desperation, just the calm certainty of a river that knows where it's going. A few men snickered. Must be lonely out in those woods. The auctioneer cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. You don't want to see what you're buying?" The tall man tilted his head toward the silent woman. "I ain't buying a face," he said, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm marrying a person." And just like that, the laughter died. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Name," the auctioneer muttered, pulling out a ledger. "Silas Boone, lumberman, Northridge." The auctioneer scribbled, his hand shaking slightly. "Fine. Let it be known that Mr. Silas Boone has entered a lawful marital contract." He shoved the paper toward Silas, who signed it with a steady hand. Then he turned back to the woman. "You're now legally wed, miss. State your name for the record." The sackcloth shifted. A long, terrible silence stretched out. The crowd leaned in, waiting. Then, a voice came from under the hood, so soft you had to strain to hear it. A whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 miles. "Annabelle Crow." Silas froze. His whole body went rigid. The crowd murmured, but Silas heard nothing but that name. His eyes, which had been calm and unreadable, widened for just a fraction of a second. A flicker of something ancient and painful. Then they hardened again, fixed on the woman in the sack, on the voice that was now an echo in his soul. 3 winters ago, a blizzard that froze the world. A dark cave. the smell of blood and burning pine. A voice in the dark, a voice he had never forgotten, a name he was only hearing for the first time. Suddenly, it all came rushing back. The howling wind, the bloody snow, the face he never saw. He stepped onto the platform, his movements slow and deliberate. He took the woman's arm. Not rough, not urgent. Just a firm, steady pressure that said one thing: "You are safe now." No one dared to stop them as they walked away. Not a single word was spoken. Just the sound of his heavy boots on the dusty planks, and the whisper of a name that now hung in the air between them like a ghost. Annabel Crow. The forest swallowed them whole. The trail back to Silas's cabin wasn't much of a trail at all, just a path worn into the earth by his own 2 feet. The trees grew so thick they blotted out the sun, casting everything in a deep green twilight. Annabel walked behind him, the sack still tied tight around her neck. The silence between them was heavy, a living thing made of unspoken questions and buried fears. Silas led an old mule piled with their few supplies. He never looked back, never spoke. He just walked, his eyes scanning the trees as if he was listening for something only he could hear. They reached his cabin as the last light was dying. It was a small, solid place, built from dark pine logs, tucked against a hillside that blocked the cruel north wind. A stack of firewood was piled neatly by the door, and a rusted horseshoe was nailed above the frame for luck. Silas pushed the door open with a low creak and stepped aside. "You pick where you stand," he said, his voice quiet. "No one's going to place you anymore." Annabel entered slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the smooth wooden floor. She didn't look around the small room. She didn't sit at the single table. Instead, she went to the farthest wall, crouched down with her back to the room, and wrapped her arms around her knees. She became a small, still shadow in the corner of his home. Silas didn't press her. He didn't ask a single question. He simply moved to the cast-iron stove, added some wood to the embers, and began to cook. The only sounds were the clink of iron and the gentle hiss of water beginning to boil. Soon, a warm, rich smell filled the cabin. Smoked meat, wild herbs, a hint of cinnamon. He moved with a practiced rhythm, a man who had made this meal for himself 1,000 times before. When the stew was ready, he ladled some into a wooden bowl and placed it on the floor near her. She flinched at his closeness but didn't turn. He then sat at the table with his own bowl and began to eat, not rushing, not staring, just giving her space and time. After a few long minutes, her muffled voice came from the corner. "What is this?" Silas looked down at his bowl. "I call it the meal for the last one standing." There was a pause, and then a sound that was almost a laugh, but it was choked off before it could be born. "Used to make it for myself after long hauls in the woods," he added, his voice soft. "Then I started making 2 bowls, even when there was no one to eat the second." She turned her head just slightly, the sackcloth rustling. She could just see him out of the corner of her eye, and she saw it. On the empty chair beside him sat a second bowl, identical to his, steam rising from it. "I used to set it for my wife," Silas said, his voice laced with an old sorrow. "After the war, after the trees took more than they gave. It was just a way to say I'd come home alive again." He paused. "Tonight I set it for her, and for you." The fire crackled, filling the heavy silence. Slowly, Annabel reached for the bowl he had left for her. Her hands trembled, but she gripped the spoon tightly. Without removing the sack, she guided the spoon underneath the edge and brought it to her mouth. She ate every last bite in silence. That night, Silas washed the bowls in a tin basin by the stove. Annabel remained in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching him. But for the first time since he'd laid eyes on her, she wasn't shaking. The fire burned down to a deep orange glow. Silas sat before the hearth, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He didn't light a lantern. He didn't need to. The shadows were company enough. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, a lonely, familiar sound. He wasn't just feeling the warmth of the fire. He was feeling the chill of a memory. 3 years ago, a winter so cold it felt like the world was ending. The snow was deep, the air sharp enough to cut. He'd pushed too far north, chasing prime timber, driven by pride. He slipped on an icy slope, his leg twisting beneath him with a sickening crack. He fell into a deep snowbank, far from any trail. The snow began to cover him like a burial shroud, and he had given up. He was ready to let the cold take him. But then, he felt hands, rough, calloused hands, pulling him, dragging him through the snow. The pain was immense, but it meant he was alive. Then, darkness. He woke up to the crackle of a fire. He was in a small cave, hidden behind a curtain of frozen vines. A fire blazed beside him, and the air smelled of boiled bark and something bitter. Across the small fire sat a figure, a woman. Her face was completely hidden beneath a sackcloth, tied just like the one Annabelle wore now. She was wrapped in layers of scavenged wool and leather. Her hands moved with a quiet efficiency, pouring a steaming liquid into a tin cup. When she spoke, her voice was soft, measured, and weary. "You don't need to know who I am," she had said, "but I'm not going to let you die here." He tried to speak, to thank her, but his throat was raw, and no sound came out. "Drink this," she commanded gently. "Pine bark and lichen. It'll fight the fever." He drank. It was bitter, but it was warm. She had tended to his broken leg, setting it with splints made from branches and wrapping it tightly. She kept the fire roaring all through the night as he drifted in and out of consciousness, battling the pain and the cold. When he woke again, the cruel blue light of a winter morning filled the cave. She was gone. The only things she'd left behind were a low, carefully banked fire and a small, folded square of cloth. On it, she had embroidered a pattern of small purple flowers, the stitches uneven but deliberate. He had kept it. It was in his coat pocket right now. And now, sitting in the corner of his cabin, was a woman with the same voice, the same quiet way of moving, the same need to hide her face. And a name. Annabelle Crow. He closed his eyes, leaning into the warmth of the fire. He didn't need any more proof. He had known it the second she spoke her name on that auction stage. The woman who saved his life had desperately wanted to disappear. And here she was, still hiding, still a ghost to the world. But not to him. He didn't tell her that night. He let the secret sit between them, a silent bridge between the past and the present. He glanced over his shoulder at the small shape huddled by the wall. The same sack, the same fear. But this time, Silas thought, she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build a life on. The next morning, mist clung to the forest floor, a soft gray blanket hiding the secrets of the night. Annabelle stepped out of the cabin alone. She moved with a new kind of quietness, not of fear, but of contemplation. She walked to the edge of the clearing, to a tall pine that stood like a silent guardian, and sat at its base. The sack was still on her head, but she no longer seemed bowed by its weight. She sat there for a long time, just listening to the forest wake up. Then, with hands that trembled only slightly, she reached behind her head and began to loosen the knot. She didn't take the sack off completely. She just lifted it enough so that the cool morning air could touch her face. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was a beginning. Silas saw her from the side of the cabin, where he was sharpening the teeth of his crosscut saw. He didn't get up. He didn't call out to her. He just spoke, his voice low and steady, as if he were talking to the trees themselves. "I got hurt once. Bad. Deep winter, up near Black Ridge. Should have died out there." His hands never stopped their rhythmic work on the saw blade. "But someone found me, Pulled me into a cave, saved my life. Annabelle didn't move, but he knew she was listening. She wore a sack over her head, he continued. Wouldn't say her name, barely let me see her hands. He paused, then turned his head just enough for his words to carry clearly across the clearing. But I remember her voice. Your voice sounds just like hers. There was a long, ringing silence. Then a soft, scratching sound. The sound of rough fabric sliding over skin. He didn't look up, not yet. He waited until he could feel her eyes on him. When he finally raised his head, she was staring directly at him. The sack lay in a heap in her lap. Her face was not deformed. It was not monstrous. It was the face of a woman who had survived hell. A long, curved scar snaked its way from her right temple down to the line of her jaw. It was an old scar, white and deep, a permanent map of a past horror. She met his gaze, no longer hiding. She was just there. The man who ran the boarding house where I worked, she began, her voice a raw whisper. He said I could keep my room if I offered extra. She swallowed hard. I said no. He didn't like that. She looked down for a moment, gathering her strength, then looked back at Silas. He came at me. I fought back. I pushed him. He slipped. His head hit the iron stove. She stared past Silas now, lost in the memory. He died. I ran. Silas's jaw was a hard line, but he remained silent, letting her tell her story. They said I killed him on purpose, that I lured him in. Her voice cracked. There were no witnesses, no one to speak for me. They called me a liar, a temptress, a killer. She looked down at her own hands, as if she couldn't believe they were capable of such a thing. Silas finally stood, wiping the oil from his hands with a rag. They sold me off to pay his debts, she went on, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Passed me from one man to another like livestock. They put the sack on my face to make it easier, to make me nothing. She looked at the burlap sack in her lap with disgust. I kept wearing it so people wouldn't look at me like I was poison, so they wouldn't see this scar and decide what I was worth before I even opened my mouth. She looked up at him again, her eyes fierce and glassy with unshed tears. I didn't ask to be saved. I didn't ask to be bought. But I am so tired of hiding. Silas took a step toward her, then stopped. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just nodded, his eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding. Thank you, he said, his voice warm and real. For telling me. You didn't have to. But you did. She blinked hard, but the tears didn't fall. She just let out a long, shuddering breath. And in that one breath, everything changed. She wasn't a shadow in a sack anymore. She was Annabelle Crow, a woman with a name, a face, and a story. And Silas had seen all three, and hadn't turned away. But what Silas did next would change everything all over again. He walked back into the cabin without another word. Annabelle watched him go, a fresh wave of uncertainty washing over her. Had she said too much? Had the sight of her scar, the truth of her past, finally been enough to make him regret his $2? She clutched the burlap sack in her lap, the old instinct to hide rising in her throat. He emerged a moment later, holding something in his hand. He walked back to her and knelt in the dirt before her. He slowly opened his palm. Lying there was a small, folded square of cloth. On it, embroidered in faded purple thread, were tiny wildflowers. The very same cloth she had left by the fire in the cave 3 years ago. Her breath caught in her chest. It was impossible. She had thought it lost to the snow, to time, just like the woman who made it. You, she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. You were the man in the cave. Silas nodded slowly. I never forgot your voice, Annabelle. And I never threw this away. It was a promise. That somewhere out in this cruel world, there was still some kindness left. She stared at the small piece of fabric. the uneven stitches she had made with a stolen needle and thread in the dead of winter. It had been a prayer, a small piece of beauty in a world of ugliness. She had left it as a farewell. She never dreamed he would keep it, or that it would lead him back to her. Tears finally welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, tracing a new path alongside the old scar. But these were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of a different kind altogether. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the embroidered flowers. "I thought I was a ghost," she whispered. "You were never a ghost to me," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were the woman who saved my life." In that moment, under the watchful eyes of the ancient pines, two broken pieces of the world finally found each other. They weren't just a lumberman and a fugitive anymore. They were two survivors, bound by a secret act of kindness in a frozen cave, a secret that had now bloomed into a fragile, impossible hope in the morning sun. But that hope was about to be tested, because out on the trail, a shadow was stirring. A man was asking questions, and he was getting closer every day. The peace they had found was just a quiet moment before a storm, and neither of them knew that the worst was yet to come. The first sign of trouble wasn't a rider on the horizon or a warning from town. It was much smaller than that. It was the sound of a twig snapping in the woods at midnight, a sound that didn't belong to any night creature Silas knew. He was instantly awake, his hand reaching for the axe he kept by his bed. He lay there listening, every muscle tense. He heard it again. A heavy, clumsy footstep. Not an animal. A man. He slipped out of his cot, moving with the silence of a predator. Annabelle was awake too, sitting bolt upright on her pallet, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. He put a finger to his lips, then crept to the cabin's single window, peering through a tiny gap in the curtain. Two men stood at the edge of the clearing, their figures illuminated by the pale moonlight. He recognized them from the auction. They were drunk, swaying on their feet, passing a bottle back and forth. "I'm tellin' you, Jed," one of them slurred, his voice carrying on the still night air. "He's got her stashed in there, the girl in the sack. I want to see what $2 gets you in this territory." "Leave it be, Cal," the other one muttered, though he made no move to leave. "Boone's a tough customer." "I ain't afraid of no tree chopper," Cal spat. "I just want to look. See the face that's got to be so ugly she hides it under burlap." Annabelle flinched as if he'd struck her. All the progress she had made, all the fragile trust she had built, seemed to shatter in that one cruel moment. She instinctively reached for the sack, which lay folded at the foot of her bed. Silas's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to let this happen. He wasn't going to let them poison the sanctuary he had tried to build. He grabbed his heavy coat, slipped it on, and moved toward the door. Annabelle let out a small, panicked gasp. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't go out there." "They won't leave us be until they get what they came for," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "They think they can scare us. They're wrong." He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close softly behind him. The two men startled, spinning around. "Evenin', boys," Silas said, his voice deceptively calm. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. He was a mountain of a man, and the moonlight cast his shadow long and menacing across the clearing. "We ain't looking for trouble, Boone," Jed stammered, taking a step back. "Looks like trouble found you anyway," Silas replied, his eyes like chips of ice. "This is my land, and that's my wife in that cabin. You've got 10 seconds to get off my property before I introduce you to the sharp end of my axe." Cal, emboldened by the liquor, puffed out his chest. "We just wanted to say hello to the lady. See if she's happy with her purchase." That was the wrong thing to say. In a flash, Silas was off the porch. He moved with a speed that was shocking for a man his size. He grabbed Cal by the front of his shirt, lifting him half off the ground. The bottle of whiskey crashed to the earth. "The only purchase made that day?" Silas snarled, his face inches from Cal's. "Was the one that saved her from animals like you. Now get out! And if you or anyone else ever comes up this trail again uninvited, you won't be walking back down." He threw Cal to the ground. The man scrambled to his feet, his drunken bravado gone, replaced by pure fear. He and Jed stumbled back into the darkness, crashing through the underbrush like frightened deer. Silas stood there for a long time, watching them go, his chest heaving. When he finally turned and went back inside, Annabelle was standing in the middle of the room, clutching the burlap sack to her chest like a shield. Her face was pale, her eyes haunted. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Or others will come. They'll never leave us alone." "Let them come," Silas said, his voice rough with a protective fury she had never heard before. He walked over to her and gently took the sack from her hands. He tossed it onto the table. "You are done with this," he said, his voice softer now. "You will never hide your face again. Not for them. Not for anyone." He reached out and gently touched her scar, his calloused thumb tracing the line with an incredible tenderness. "This isn't a mark of shame, Annabelle. It's a mark of survival. And I've never seen anything more beautiful." But even as he said it, a cold dread settled in his stomach. The men were just drunken fools, but they were a symptom of a larger disease. Word was spreading. A girl with a scar, a lumberman hiding her away. Sooner or later, that talk would reach the wrong ears. It would reach someone far more dangerous than a couple of drunks. Someone who was hunting for a girl who had disappeared after her boss's head hit an iron stove. The real threat wasn't at their door yet, but Silas could feel it coming, like a change in the wind before a hurricane. The peace they'd carved out in the woods was gone. The world was coming for them. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, riding a tired-looking horse. The man called himself Cutter. He was lean and wiry, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a stillness about him that was more dangerous than any loud threat. He wasn't a drifter, he was a hunter, the kind of man who could track a whisper across 100 miles of badlands. He didn't come to the cabin. He was smarter than that. He went to the logging post near North Ridge, claiming to be looking for work. He bought drinks for the timbermen, listened to their stories, and casually dropped Silas's name. It didn't take long for the story of the $2 bride to spill out. A girl in a sack, a mysterious past, a scar. Cutter listened, nodded, and the next morning, he was gone. But Silas knew. One of the loggers, a friend named Eli, rode up to the cabin late that afternoon, his face grim. "There was a man asking about you, Silas," Eli said, not dismounting. "A bounty hunter. Calls himself Cutter. He was asking about Annabelle." Silas's blood ran cold. It was happening. The nightmare was no longer a fear. It was a man on a horse. He went back inside. Annabelle was by the stove, but she had heard. She turned to face him, her eyes steady but her face drained of all color. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling fire. Then, without a word, Annabelle walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of her cot. She knelt and opened the lid. She reached inside and pulled out the old stained burlap sack. She held it in her hands, the rough fabric a familiar weight. "I will wear it again," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "One more time." "You don't have to do that," Silas said, his voice tight. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not fear, but a cold, hard resolve he had never seen before. "This time, I choose it," she said. "Not for shame. For strategy." A plan formed between them that night, born of desperation and courage. It was a wild, dangerous gamble, but it was the only one they had. Annabelle would ride east, taking the old fire road. She would wear the sack. Cutter, hunting a ghost, would follow the ghost. Silas would ride the faster mountain pass, cut across, and get the sheriff from town. He would tell the sheriff about the illegal pursuit, that Cutter was a bounty hunter operating outside his jurisdiction, hunting a woman without a proper warrant. They would lay a trap in the narrow canyons to the east. It all depended on Cutter taking the bait. At dawn, as the sky was just beginning to blush pink, Annabelle mounted Silas's spare horse. He placed the sack over her head, his hands gentle. "Ride steady," he whispered. "Don't look back." She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. But this time, she wasn't trembling. She was a warrior going into battle. She kicked the horse into a trot and disappeared into the trees. By midday, Cutter had found her trail. The trap was set. He followed her for hours, a patient predator closing in on his prey. He saw the sacked figure on the horse ahead, a lone woman, an easy target. He didn't rush. He savored the hunt. He followed her deep into the eastern rocks, into a narrow pass with high canyon walls on either side. Just as he was about to make his move, a voice echoed from the rocks above. "That's far enough, Cutter." It was the sheriff. Cutter looked up and saw him, rifle in hand, flanked by Silas and 2 deputies. He was trapped. Cutter was fast, his hand a blur as it went for his pistol. But Silas was faster. A single shot from his rifle kicked Cutter's gun from his hand, sending it spinning into the dust. They had him. He was disarmed, bound, and thrown over the back of his own horse. Annabelle watched it all from a hilltop, a silent, shrouded figure. Only when Cutter was being led away did she ride down. Silas rushed to her side, helping her from the horse. Her whole body was shaking now, the adrenaline finally fading. Slowly, she reached up and untied the knot at the base of her neck. The sack slipped free. She folded it once, twice, holding the rough fabric in her hands. "It saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "One last time, not because it hid me, but because I used it." She looked up at him, her face streaked with dust and tears, the scar a proud, defiant line. And for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. A real, true smile. But their victory was short-lived. As the sheriff was securing Cutter, he pulled a folded, official-looking paper from the bounty hunter's coat. It was a warrant. Not for a Jane Doe, but for an Annabelle Crow. It was old, issued from back east, but it was legal. "I'm sorry, Silas," the sheriff said, his face grim. "I can hold him for illegal pursuit, maybe for a few days. But this warrant, this changes things. Legally, she's his bounty. He'll be back for her. And next time, he'll be within the law." The hope that had soared so high just moments before crashed back to earth. They hadn't won. They had only bought themselves a little time. Cutter was coming back. And the law was on his side. The knock on the cabin door came 3 days later. It wasn't the heavy, confident knock of a bounty hunter. It was soft, hesitant. Silas opened the door with his axe in his hand, expecting the worst. A woman stood on the porch. Her dress was dusty from the road, her face etched with weariness. She was an older black woman, with kind, cautious eyes. She held a worn hat in her hands. "My name is Mavis Green," she said, her voice quiet. "I used to work at the Ridley boarding house. I was the cook." Behind Silas, Annabelle froze. Mavis's eyes found hers, and she took a half step back, as if startled. "I heard you were up this way," she said, her gaze fixed on Annabelle. "And I figured it was time I stopped being a coward." The wind whispered through the pines, filling the sudden, tense silence. "I saw what happened that night," Mavis said, her voice gaining strength. "I saw Ridley drag you into that back room. I heard you scream. I heard the crash." She looked down at her hands. "But I didn't speak up. I was scared. I needed the job." Her eyes lifted again, filled with a deep, pained regret. "I'm not proud of it. But I can make it right, if you'll let me." Over a cup of hot tea at the small wooden table, Mavis told them everything. She described Ridley's cruelty, his advances, the fear he instilled in his staff. Her testimony was the missing piece, the truth that Annabel thought had died in that room with Ridley. With Silas's help, they wrote it all down. Mavis signed the affidavit with a strong, steady hand. Silas rode into town that very day and sent it by the fastest horseback courier to the circuit judge, 2 territories over. Then, they waited. The days crawled by. Every shadow seemed to be Cutter. Every sound in the woods was his horse. They lived on a knife's edge, knowing their time was running out. 1 week passed, then another. One morning, as the sun was just cresting the ridge, 2 riders appeared on the trail. It was the sheriff, and behind him, bound in the saddle, was Cutter. "Morning, Silas," the sheriff said, a grim smile on his face. "Got a telegraph from Judge Miller last night. Your affidavit arrived. He reviewed the case." He dismounted and pulled an envelope from his coat. He handed it to Silas, who opened it with trembling fingers. He read it once, then twice, before walking into the cabin and handing it to Annabel. Her eyes scanned the few lines of text. Charges against Annabel Crow dropped. Case closed. Warrant rescinded. The paper fluttered from her fingers. She walked out of the cabin, past Silas, past the sheriff, down to the edge of the woods. She knelt at the base of the tall pine, the one that had been her sanctuary, and pressed her forehead against the rough bark. She didn't cry. She just breathed. Deep, shuddering breaths of a woman who had been running her whole life and had finally been allowed to stop. Justice hadn't come with a thunderclap. It had come with the quiet courage of a good woman who decided to speak the truth. Spring came to the ridge in earnest. The trees dressed themselves in soft green buds, and wildflowers pushed their way through the damp earth. Silas, with a quiet purpose, built a simple wooden canopy in the clearing, draped with a clean linen sheet. He invited only a few people. Mavis came, her smile as bright as the morning sun. The old blacksmith from town, who had always been kind to Silas, came bearing a bottle of apple brandy. The sheriff came, not as a lawman, but as a friend. Annabel stood before the small mirror in the cabin. She wore a simple dress the color of cream, one she had stitched herself. And on her head, she wore a veil. It was made from the old burlap sack. Silas had washed it, sun-dried it, and cut it with care. And in the corners, embroidered in the same faint purple thread from the handkerchief, were tiny wildflowers, a symbol of her past, reclaimed and transformed into a promise for her future. When she stepped out of the cabin, Silas was waiting under the canopy. He watched her walk toward him, not as a ghost or a fugitive, but as his bride. She was beautiful, not in spite of the scar, but because of it. It was a testament to the woman she was. He took her hands in his. "No matter what covered your face," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you were always the woman I chose. And now, you're the woman I vow to stand beside until the end." Annabel smiled, a smile of pure, unburdened peace. "And I vow the same," she whispered. There was no priest, just the trees as their witness. When they kissed, a soft rain began to fall, as if the sky itself was weeping with joy. Mavis leaned over to the blacksmith. "Never thought I'd see a burlap sack turned into a wedding veil," she whispered. Then she added, "And I never thought it could be so damn beautiful." The blacksmith chuckled. "Ain't the sack," he said. "It's the woman who turned it into something more." That evening, as the fire crackled, Annabel sat beside Silas on the porch steps. The veil lay folded in her lap. She ran her fingers over the embroidered flowers. "This thing," she said softly, "used to mean everything I was afraid of." He looked at her, his heart full. "And now?" She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Now, it means everything I chose. They sat there until the stars filled the sky, two survivors who had found a home not in a place, but in each other. Their love story wasn't one of perfection. It was one of redemption. It didn't erase the scars, but it turned them into a map of how they found their way home. Thank you for joining us on this journey of survival, courage, and redemption. If you believe that love is the greatest frontier of all, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss our next story from the heart of the Wild West. Until then, keep your aim true and your heart open.